Habitat. There is a well-established correlation between reported Yowie sightings and habitat, water and life. In nearly all reports, if researched closely, there is a healthy source of water close by. Where there's a larger volume of water, there is an increase of sightings in the broader surrounds. Where there is a more sizable quantity of inland water, it is often a man-made lake, weir or dam. Dams and weirs are constructed in the basin of mountains, making the perfect habitat for climate, sustainable food and water, concealment from weather elements, and above all, humans. The perfect place to hide and survive for any man or animal. The Great Dividing Range on the eastern seaboard provides great examples of these known Yowie sighting areas. These include the Yowiehunters and Hinds dams for Queensland, in Sydney, the Woronora and Warragamba dams, and in Victoria, the Thompson and Sylvan Dam, which is also known for many big cat and thylacine sightings. The Great Dividing Range holds the majority of all Australian sightings. But what about the areas without this great mountain range and the abundance of water sources? For example, what about the other side of the country, which is primarily known to the Easterners as simply a land of mostly dry, flat plains and desert? It might be surprising to some of us east side snobs that not all of Western Australia is desert, and they too have sightings, and they're growing. Recent reports to the AYR include Jarrahdale, Mandaring Weir, Meckering, on the edge of the vast wetlands, Mandurah, Danalap Dam and Christmas Creek, Australind, the Wellington Reservoir. I think you're getting the drift. Roleystone, on the edge of the Canning Reservoir, Harvey Dam, Greenbushes, near the Nooralap Dam and Greenbushes Pool, Minganoo, on the Food Bowl and next to the Lockyer River, Kalamunda, near the Mundaring Weir. All sightings close to a water source. This week, Sarah investigates a disturbing report from Jarrahdale. Welcome to the Serpentine Dam.
What happened was I've camped at this dam previously and I've had no experiences but very, very little animal activity. There's no kangaroos out there. There's no wallabies. There's nothing. I was out there by myself. There's no walking tracks. There's one four-wheel drive track that only leads maybe 500 metres into the bush, and at the end of that, there's a wild pig trap. Once you go past that, there are no tracks, nothing at all. And so I was using my machete just to cut my way through a bracken fern. I came across a small track. It was quite wide up the top and narrow down in the middle, down the bottom where you would normally walk. I've never seen a trackway that looked like that at all. I was quite surprised, and I noticed that it went all the way down to the water and then all the way back up where the water feeds into the dam. I decided just to walk this track if I could see anything or if I could try and figure out what it was, because it was quite well defined. So I started walking up away from the dam and towards the hill section of the area, and I walked about 20 metres, and there was a tree on the left-hand side. The track goes past it, but as I started walking up, on the left-hand side of the tree, because this tree is on the left-hand side as well, so on the left-hand side of the tree, I noticed it wasn't really a hand, it was three or four fingers just moved behind the tree. I'm thinking to myself, what the was that? I've had a few experiences with wild animals. My first response is not to fight or to flight, it's just to freeze and then slowly start backing up. As I started doing that, I'd walked about 3 steps backwards from the right-hand side of the tree and straight onto the track. This thing just stood out. And it was smaller than me. It came up to a little bit higher than my sternum. I'm about 5'11", nearly 6 foot. I was judging this thing to be about 4 foot high, and this thing was so wide and so stumpy. Like didn't have stumpy legs, but short legs because the arms were longer. They were near its knees, or just its hands were past its knees. That's the best way that I could describe it. And it stood out, and it just looked at me it was pure rage and shock and fear. You could see these things playing across its face instantly. I could shit myself. I had no idea what to do. When it looked at me and we registered each other, I would have had fear and shock in my eyes. There was no anger. This thing just raised its arms above its head and took 2 steps towards me and then just turned around and took off running. And it was grunting and it was snorting. And it covered, I don't know, I wasn't really in my right mind. And to think about it now, I'm not in my right mind now, just thinking about it. But would have run up the hill about 50 metres in about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 seconds. This thing was so goddamn fast, it wasn't funny. If it decided to attack me, I think this thing probably would have killed me. But it didn't. It got up to the top of the hill and it turned around, sort of like bent down and picked up a rock, but it was screaming at me. And this thing was so loud. It was so loud. It felt like the scream almost rattled my eyeballs. That's how it felt. And it was a high-pitched, I don't know how to describe it. It was sort of cross between a mountain lion and a bear. That's the best way to describe it, because it was high-pitched, but it had this deep-throated roar as it finished. And it just moved its arm, and then I felt it was a rock, because I noticed when it came past me, I heard it, and it was so close to my face. I heard it hit the tree behind me. After that, as soon as it threw the rock, and I felt that go past my ear, it just took off back down the hill, down the other side of the hill. And I could hear it. I could hear it running through the bush for a good 50 metres, and then it just got quieter and quieter. I'm a 40-year-old grown man, but I went back to my campsite and I cried. I was so frightened of this thing. After about an hour, I picked myself up together and I grabbed my tent, because I've got a little one-man tent. I actually waited on the outskirts of where everybody is, because the water corp is there, and I just waited out of sight. And at 5:30, the gate closes and the park's closed, and I immediately, where the water corporation has their pumping stations and stuff, it's got a very, very high barbed wire fence. And I grabbed all my stuff, threw it over the top and jumped over and in there, and I camped there. That night, I had no fire because I didn't want to light a fire. I just used my little trangier and I cooked my food in that. All through the night, there were no really weird noises. I heard one wood knock, what I know now is a wood knock, and I had a stick land on my tent that night, but that could have just been from the trees, because the trees overhang this area. When I was sitting outside the tent that night, I did feel like I was being watched for a little while, but that went away pretty fast. And that's about all I can really say. The next morning, I got up at 5:30, packed up all my stuff. I got out of the barbed wire area and I went back down to where the pipes were. My father picked me up at about 9:30 that morning and I was gone.
How scary. Can only imagine how terrifying that would have been.
It was shocking to see. I mean, this thing's face, it was so human and it wasn't. It's the only way that I can really describe it. Its hair was like, when it was running up the track, at one stage it got into broad daylight and you could see it. It was like the tips of its hair was red and then it just went darker and darker as it went in, not the other way around. I'm a little bit out of my mind at the moment just thinking about this, because it was a year ago and I'm September last year. So, yeah, it's been a fair while.
when someone has a really frightening experience, especially with something so mysterious and unknown and out there. As a hairy man, it's totally normal to feel traumatized and shaky. And even when you bring it up years later, I've spoken to people who've experienced something 30 years ago and still get the shakes, and you can hear the fear in their voice still after all that time. So don't be too hard on yourself.
At first, I thought it was like 5.5 feet tall, but the fact is that it was standing on one of the roots of the tree that was actually hanging out into the track when it confronted me. I didn't actually realise that until me and my brother went back there and we took a rough measurement. It would have been about 4 foot tall, 4.5 feet tall.
Did you get the feeling it was male or female?
Oh, not really. My best suggestion, just with the pure rage in its face at the end, it wasn't shock. It was more fear at first when it seen me, and then it was just pure anger and rage after that. The best suggestion that I could make, because the only time I've seen rage like that comes from a male.
What was it doing with its face to make you feel that?
At first, its eyes were wide open. You could see the tiny little bit of light that it had in its eyes because it was frightened of me. That's the only overall thing. And then because I was backing up and mine was shock and fear, it just turned into rage. But it raised its arms above its head, and I've been looking into it, and that's what primates do when they feel threatened. They try to lift their arms up above their head and make themselves bigger. But it took 2 steps towards me, and I automatically put my hands up. And as soon as I did that, it just turned around and took off.
Take me back to when you first noticed the hand.
It would have had 5 digits. They were quite short, stumpy, fat fingers. That's the best way that I can describe them. They had hair. You can see that the hair ended sort of midway through the fingers, if you know what I mean. Like the tops of its fingers were covered with like hair, not as much as the body, but it was still covered. And then when it showed itself to me and I seen it running, I knew that it had no hair on the palms of its hands or on its pads of its hands, but they were short, stumpy fingers, and they had very, very wide, yellow, nasty fingernails on them, and they were broken. That's the best way that I can describe it. When I was walking, the only reason why I noticed it is because I think it moved its thumb. I'm quite aware of myself and things in the bush after being chased by from cassowary up in North Queensland, having experiences with a lot of crocs as well. So I'm very aware of movement out of the corner of my eye or just off of my peripherals. Usually either means the wind's blowing or there's something dangerous near you, and that's what I got. But I had no feeling of being watched, and I smelt nothing. I'm sorry, I'm rambling.
Totally fine. You just talk. Just get it all out. Because I know it's really hard because there's usually not that many people you can talk about this stuff with.
No.
So what colour was the skin on the hands?
It wasn't our colour, like I'm Caucasian, so it wasn't white. It wasn't dark. It was sort of like a grey, dark grey. That's the best way that I can describe it. It was sort of like a silvery dark grey.
Silvery dark grey skin and then big yellow square nails and reddish kind of hair.
Yeah, I know that sounds fantastic, but that's what it was.
After you've noticed the hand, then you notice a head peeking out from behind the tree.
Going back in my mind, it was just more the top of its head, which was conical. Not as conical as like you would have on a full primate. It was quite high. It was more like the top of its head and just the shadow of the corner of its eye as it pulled backwards. Mm-hmm. So I knew that it was looking at me. I seen the thing out of the peripherals, and I looked over it at the hand. I seen the fingers, and as I went to look at the tree itself, I seen the head poke backwards, if you know what I mean.
When did you actually see the face with those expressions on it?
When it stepped out.
When it stepped out, and then it has all these expressions. So you mentioned that it was fear and anger. The eyes were wide. What was it doing with its mouth?
At first, it was like open, was partly open, like it was taking a big, big breath. As it changed to anger, it sort of like peeled its lips back and snarled at me, but it didn't have fangs like you would on like a gorilla per se or a chimp. It had eye teeth like us that were slightly longer, but they weren't big. You know, they weren't big and menacing or anything like that. They looked more like our teeth with slightly longer eye teeth, but they were yellow.
I was going to ask you, so they were a yellow colour.
Yeah.
It stepped out, looked at you first with fear, and then what you felt was just anger. What did it do then?
Pure rage.
Pure rage.
It just lifted up its arms. Well, it sort of snarled. Well, it didn't snarl. There was no noise, but it peeled back its lips and showed me its teeth. When it did that, it lifted its arms in the air and took 2 steps. I did a lot of martial arts as a young kid, so I automatically went into a taekwondo stance. And as soon as I put my hands up, and as soon as I did that, it just turned around and took off like an Olympic sprinter.
Did you see the rest of the body then as it ran off?
Oh, yes. I wasn't looking between the legs or looking for breasts or anything like that. My body was just in a total state of shock. I seen the body, and it was very wide at the shoulders. It was as wide as me, easily as wide as me, and that's what the track looked like. It was wide at the top and narrow on the bottom. I can only say that this was the thing that was making that track. Later on, me and my brother went back. Since we've been there, there's a massive cross there now. There's a massive X.
Is there? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's fucking huge. I don't know if this thing made it or whether it's natural. We just seen it. Me and my brother didn't want to go anywhere near it. But it's interlocked with another tree. It's one dead tree and one live tree, and they're interlocked together, and it's huge. I mean, this X probably reaches 10 metres in the air where it crosses over.
And it wasn't there when you were there?
It wasn't there last time.
So it was reddish all over?
Yeah, it was. It was red-black. It was red on the tips, and as it started going in, it was darker. The only way I've seen the red in it is because it ran under full sunlight. There was no dappled shade or dappled sunlight. It was just full sunlight, and it ran, and all of a sudden, it just tips of its fur just went red, dark red.
Did you see the skin on the chest or going down the belly at all, or was it hairy all the way down?
The best way that I can say it was less thick on the front than it was on the back, but it was still very, very thick.
Did you see any feet?
Yes. Yes, I did. Well, I didn't see it from the front because I was only looking at its face when it stepped out. When it was running, I seen the pads of its feet. They were bare in the same colour as its hands, but they were caked in crap, like the undergrowth of the bush. The thing is that the rest of its body was fairly clean, and I could smell nothing. Its feet were very, very wide, like Thorpe wide, but very, very short as well. So it was about the same size as you can see as a 4-foot high person, same size feet, but just a hell of a lot wider.
It runs away from you really, really fast. You said it crossed
Like an Olympic sprinter.
50 metres in a couple of seconds, in a few seconds. And then it turned around and threw a rock at you, or did it scream at you first?
It let off the scream as it threw the rock. Right. It was sort of the same time, like, I don't know whether the scream started first or whether he threw the rock first, because I'm still in shock now, like trying to think about it and trying to actually get the facts right. It was screaming when the rock whizzing past my ear. Then
that scream was high pitched, but you said cross between a mountain lion and a bear.
Yeah, at first it was so fucking high pitched. I mean, this thing would have been heard for miles. I'm surprised that people didn't come from the water corp, didn't come into the bush. So they obviously know something that I don't. But at the end of it, as I said, it was rattling my eyeballs in my brain and its skull. That's the tone of the voice, or the tone of the scream in the end. It's just high pitched. When it was dying off, it just got low.
It ran off and then just disappeared into the bush, and you didn't see it again.
I never seen it again.
You hadn't seen anything like that beforehand either, had you?
Never. This thing was terrifying.
They generally are. Like, I've talked to a lot of people, and I rarely meet anyone who comes away going, oh, that was cute. Everyone I speak to is traumatised and terrified. You mentioned in your email that the name Wood Archies, Noongar word for Yowie.
Yowie. Yeah, that's correct.
I had heard it before. I just couldn't remember where it was from, but it's a WA Noongar word.
It's a WA thing. I'm pretty sure about it. My friend's father in Nannup actually told me that. He said there's heaps of wood archies up there, and I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. I just went, oh, yeah, okay. So, and then I found out what the hell they actually are. And I was like, hell.
Not too far away from Nannup, we've had one in Green Bushes. and that was 2008. We've got an old newspaper article from 1882 from, is it Augusta, down on the coast there?
Yep.
We've got a possible Yowie sighting up at Stirling Dam, which is a little bit further away from there. Australind.
Yeah.
Yep, we've got one there. We've got one Donnybrook, which is just south
That's not far away from Mannup at all.
There's a few around Perth. Rolly Stone.
That's up near Kalamunda, and I've heard of another sighting up there of a giant one.
And then further up the coast, there's Moore River. There's a few, but there's nowhere near as many reports as I'm sure people are actually experiencing them out there. How do you feel about going out camping these days?
I don't go camping there alone like I used to.
No, going out by yourself.
No, there's no going out by myself anymore. There has been one time when my brother and I felt like we were being watched, but we just we made our campfire a lot bigger than what we normally would. Within 15 minutes of us building up that fire, it went away. But it wasn't menacing. The watching didn't feel scary. It felt like it was more like whatever was watching us, it felt curious as to what we were doing there. There's nothing that I've heard out in the Australian bush that sounds like that. I was the ranger, I'd want to know what the hell it was, and I'd be coming out looking, and no one came.
Maybe they do know what it is and they were frightened.
This is what I'm thinking, that they do know something is out there. That's my personal opinion, though. I think that they know that there's something there.
It's my personal opinion too.
Yeah,
I think a lot of the rangers all over the country know that there's something out there.
Yeah.